being here this afternoon. My name is Michael Runtovich. I'm the Research Manager for the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC. And I'd very much like to thank the State Emergency Management Committee for including this session in the conference. The International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction has dropped off the agenda in Australia over the last few years. And it was our great pleasure last year to try to reinvigorate the day with a session at the Australian National University in Canberra. And for this to be the second of what we expect to be an ongoing series of presentations over the years for International Disaster Risk Reduction Day. We're particularly grateful to the Attorney General's Department for their support for helping put this day back on the agenda. And that includes logistical and financial support for putting the day on for us. So the idea behind the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction is to get people that work in this area, practitioners, researchers, policymakers, to get together and discuss the significant issues around disaster risk reduction. Floods, cyclones, storms, all the various disasters or natural hazards that affect Australians every day and every year. And as we're already seeing, this coming bushfire season has got off to a fast start, and we're having to deal with that in various parts of the country. There's a lot happening in the policy area, international, national, and local, state and local government levels. The UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction took place in March this year in Sendai, in Australia, a large contingent there. Many of you would be aware that the Productivity Commission has released a report about disaster funding arrangements, or natural disaster funding arrangements in May this year, and the Commonwealth and state governments are now working together to see how this will pan out over time as an issue. The Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC was started 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago now, bringing together researchers in the physical and social sciences together with representatives of our end user partners, the people who put the research into practice. And that's in operations, in policy, and various other levels. And the University of Western Australia, we're pleased to say, is a significant partner in the CRC with a couple of the projects. You heard Chari Padirachi speaking earlier, and David Panel leading a couple of projects within the CRC. And it's a research centre which covers every state and territory. We've got over 20 universities and about 30 end-user partners actively involved in the projects. We're aiming to make sure that the research is high quality and, just as importantly, or maybe more importantly, goes out into practice so that the work actually has an impact on Australian disaster risk reduction, resilience, and so on. And over the last over today and tomorrow, you'll actually have seen and will see quite a few of the projects that we're funding and see the results and the early results from those projects. So the theme for the 2015 International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction is Knowledge for Life. The aim is to raise awareness of traditional, local and Indigenous knowledge and practices that complement the current science and research in the field, and all of which aim to increase the disaster resilience of an individual and or a community and society. Today we've brought together a terrific panel, I believe. We have Erin Mercury, who's the State Manager for Emergency Services at the Australian Red Cross, and Erin's worked with Indigenous and remote communities in Western Australia. Professor Carmen Lawrence, from the University of Western Australia and former CRC researcher on community perceptions of risk when experiencing hazards. And Anne Garland, who's a research associate with the Applied Research and Environmental Sciences nonprofit in the US. And Anne's working on risk management with Indigenous groups in the US, and in particular Alaska, and in New Zealand. And in fact, I encourage you to go to Anne's presentation tomorrow on the program. This is advertised as a panel discussion. We want this to be a conversation, not just the panelists, but a conversation with everyone in here. So if you have questions, comments, statements about the use of local, traditional and Indigenous knowledge and how it applies to disaster resilience, please speak up and share that with everyone else here, because that's what we're all about. One piece of bookkeeping. When you do have a comment to make, I'll ask you please wait for the microphones. This session is being videotaped and recorded. If you're not using the microphones, we won't be able to get your contributions. So please wait for the microphones to come. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Aaron to kick things off and talk about some of the key lessons learned by the Red Cross in working with communities following an emergency and the importance of understanding local knowledge.
I'm a little bit shaky at the moment, I'm just getting over something nasty, so just bear with me. I'm hoping that I'm getting over something nasty. Sorry, everybody. I'd like to thank the Bushfire Natural Hazard CSC for inviting me to participate in this panel today. But before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on Aboriginal land, and I recognise the strength, resilience and capacity of Noongar people in this land. I've been asked to contribute to today's discussion by providing an overview of Red Cross's approach to working with communities and share some of our learnings working with communities before, during and after an emergency across the country in about 5 minutes, so we'll see how we go. So Red Cross in Australia works across what we know as the preparedness, response and recovery phases of the emergency management cycle. Red Cross views emergency preparedness, relief and recovery as being interlinked and interrelated. How prepared a person is for an emergency can affect the relief requirements, but also how well they recover. The focus of our preparedness work is to make people think of the actions they need to take to prepare themselves for the longer term psychosocial impacts of a disaster. While survival is the number one goal, there also needs to be recognition that what people have to deal with, but also what happens after a disaster. So what we like to call preparing for recovery. So community development principles guide our work with communities, such as focusing on community strengths rather than vulnerabilities, being community driven from the bottom up or from the inside out, and relationship and partnership driven. Red Cross utilises the resilience approach to working with communities. This approach recognises the importance of enabling individuals and communities to build upon inherent capacities, rather than solely relying on external interventions to overcome vulnerabilities. So I'm just going to finish up after that introduction to make a few points based on what we've learned working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across the country. Now these are pretty basic community development principles and can be certainly applied to other community work, and I'm sure you've heard them all before. So first of all, a commitment should be made to take a holistic approach to engagement and development work, building and sustaining long-term relationships at a local level. There have been many initiatives that have found success at the pilot stage, but have fallen over due to lack of funding or poor relationships, as there are many agencies on the ground undertaking great projects, but people are often working in isolation. Building relationships take time, but this is often seen as the key to success. When working in remote and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities, Red Cross utilises a place-based approach, which involves partnering Red Cross Emergency Services work with our community services programs, which are already on the ground delivering programs to communities at regional locations. Red Cross recognises that through ongoing engagement with communities over a number of years, community program staff are respected and have established positive networks and relationships that enhance emergency service engagement. Therefore, partnering with community programs helps to ensure that emergency programs are relevant, culturally appropriate and sustainable. This approach can also be applied across agencies to build networks and relationships that already exist, rather than starting from scratch. Building relationships based on trust before an emergency is also really important in a recovery context. Red Cross is currently working with communities on Elcho Island who are still putting together the pieces after Cyclone Lam, which hit earlier in the year. Red Cross has been leading consultation and engagement with the community to understand and advocate for the needs of that community. And we wouldn't have been able to do this if we hadn't built relationships beforehand in the delivery of programs for many years. So the second point, we have to have respect for local knowledge and culture, and we need to find a way to recognise these strengths to ensure that they are translated into our plans and procedures. Sometimes the vulnerabilities that people experience during a disaster are the result of external intervention, with agencies, and I include Red Cross in this as well, not always understanding what's happening at a local level. For example, through work that Red Cross has undertaken across Australia, we've come to the conclusion that many remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have a grounded understanding of the risks and an idea of what to do before and during an emergency. Customs and stories have also been developed to make sense of natural disasters, which have become a way of life. However, over the past few years, we've seen a number of errors made by agencies due to a lack of understanding of local knowledge and cultural practices, such as failing to recognise clashes between skin groups when both evacuating and relocating evacuees. We've also seen examples of people being fed culturally inappropriate food, leading to a number of health concerns and sanitary issues. While these issues are not insurmountable, but these issues highlight the importance of cultural awareness and the recognition of family ties and traditional practices as a form of resilience. We also need to share these experiences within our agencies, both the successes and the failures, to build and grow your agency's capacity to support these communities. And finally, work from a community-based approach that enables the community to reduce their own vulnerabilities through localised solutions, or to find appropriate alternatives through trusted partnerships when solutions cannot be found within the community. A member of my team has been working with communities across the Dampier Peninsula, where residents know that one of the main issues they will face is the inability to access services in the recovery context, and this is short and longer term, due to isolation, remote access, and not knowing emergency services representatives or the processes that we work under. Residents in Beagle Bay have told us, for example, that they can rely on their ability to get through a storm, but know that it will take between 2 to 3 weeks for them to get food. In the short-term solution, they can rely on fishing, for example, but they see the need to work on a solution before an event happens to ensure that the wait isn't this long in the future. During the 2012 Queensland floods, Red Cross became aware that a large Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community affected in St George had failed to access services such as power, water and food for about 10 days, which was available to the rest of the community. And this community didn't feel confident to access services and to approach government services, and they didn't feel comfortable with service providers entering their home. The local government and community elders developed a solution once these issues were made aware of, but this highlights the importance of building trusted relationships before an emergency to avoid such an issue. And I'm going to wrap it up there, and this is just a quick insight into some of the learnings that we've learnt, and the importance of acknowledging and valuing cultural knowledge, local contributions, and it's a short overview of our approach. There are many opportunities to work with communities to support resilience building and to identify ways that our procedures can incorporate local knowledge and to find appropriate solutions. The National Emergency Management Strategy for Remote Indigenous Communities will be reviewed in the very near future, and as such, it is timely to be promoting the role of local knowledge, the development of effective partnerships, and supporting communities to build on their own capacities. And these are all areas which are identified within the strategy. And there are many people in this room which I know have a wealth of experience, and I hope that you can share this with the group, either now as part of this session or later on over a drink. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Erin. I'll now throw it over to Carmen.
Hi, I'm going to take, I guess, a very different tack, coming as I do from a research background rather than working directly as Erin and the Red Cross do in many of these communities. But we've tried to ask a very important question, which is, what is it about some communities that means they're well prepared and others that mean that they're less well prepared? Is it just that they've got more households that are well prepared in some and fewer in others? What's the relationship between the individual decisions that are being made in households and properties and the kind of community in which they're embedded? Our research project was triggered, I guess, by observations that many people in the field had made, that they'd walk into one community and you seem to have people who knew what they were talking about, who were well prepared, a local government who was engaged, a fair degree of on the ground knowledge. You'd go into another community and you'd find a lot of uncertainty or people doing stupid things at the last minute when confronted by in the case that we're looking at, fire, but presumably other emergencies as well, they appeared to be wrong-footed. And so we wanted to know, what is it about those communities that perhaps defines them, and particularly their perceptions of risk and their willingness to undertake various measures and to support those who are undertaking measures on their behalf, local government, fire and emergency agencies, because that's critical as well. We wanted to try and disentangle the individual from the community ones. It was triggered in part too by responses to fires here in Western Australia. 2011, there were a number of bushfires, mainly in the peri-urban area. These are areas that are sort of where the city is sprawling out and starting to encompass bushland, and people are in more fire-prone areas. Now, some of the residents in those places had clearly been there for a long time. The city is encroaching on them. Others had arrived more recently. And what we found when we looked at those communities, and we went in and interviewed them after the event and asked them what it was they had done, where they got information from, what sort of planning they'd undertaken, who they listened to for advice, all those sorts of questions. And again, we found, demonstrated in those studies, big differences between communities. And some, like Gidgegannup, for instance, the people there appeared altogether better prepared than others, for instance, living in the hills around Perth. And we wanted to know why that was. All we had done at that stage was demonstrated. So we then undertook 2 large-scale surveys of communities, first in Western Australia, peri-urban and country, high and low risk. And we also talked to the local, I forget what the name of the department was then, forgive me, I think it was Visa at the time, about who in their view, which in their view were likely to be better prepared, local government areas, and which less well prepared. So we tried to select communities that, at least on the evidence available, were sort of top and bottom performers, as well as those who were at varying degrees of risk. And as I say, to try and untangle what mattered. So what we found, again, were clear differences between communities, and within those communities, individuals who were better and less well prepared. But what we found is that the aggregated perceptions of risk, in other words, if you added up everyone's perception of risk, the communities that were best prepared and the individuals who were best prepared both had elevated perceptions of risk. And a lot of that, we found from subsequent studies, came from them having experienced bushfires firsthand or knowing quite intimately about bushfires. In other words, it's occurred in their area. And having been participants in groups that are dealing directly, in this case with bushfires, but it could be any emergency, the bushfire ready groups, the local volunteer fire brigade, that people who, in a sense, had their hands on and knew firsthand what it was like to experience a bushfire. I guess unsurprisingly and thankfully, common sense would tell you they're the ones who, 1, perceived the bushfires to be more of a real risk, and 2, were more likely to take action. Being subjected to information and getting information from various sources didn't really help much. And that's a standard finding in psychology, that the information deficit hypothesis of why people don't act is not actually very accurate. It's really more about the experience of certain events, in this case bushfire. And we spread that survey to the national level, and we took samples in Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania, a further 18 communities, and had a look at the same kind of things, preparedness. We ended up sampling several thousand Australians. I think it's the biggest survey type work that's ever been undertaken. And not surprisingly, we picked up a lot of guys and girls like you, the ones who are actually working in the field. And of course, they were well prepared and well informed. But we got a broad enough sample to be able to say that individual characteristics do matter. If you're a homeowner, for instance, you're more likely to prepare. If you're in the country, you're more likely to prepare than if you're on the urban fringe. Your perceptions of risk are elevated if you live in the country as opposed to on the urban fringe, even if the risk is just as high. And the interesting thing, I think, is that people who live on the urban fringes have this view that someone else is going to do it. Whereas people in the country clearly have a view that they've got to roll up their sleeves and do it together. So that really reinforced what we found elsewhere, that community characteristics that involved people in preparation for bushfires, whether it was through being in the brigade, bushfire-ready groups, but basically hands-on stuff, where they had some knowledge and experience of bushfire over a period of time, whether it was because of their involvement in bushfire groups or just because they'd been there at the time, and who had these elevated perceptions of risk. And by the way, in some other work we did, who had a strong attachment to the place. They were the ones who were prepared. We found it difficult to pull apart community versus individual characteristics, but that participatory element, sometimes called social capital, networking and so on, that was critical. Communities that didn't have it didn't prepare very well. Communities that did prepared well. And it obviously suggests that intervention is possible, that you can, in a sense, engage people. That's the critical thing, not telling them stuff, but it really reinforces your point, Erin, getting them engaged so they are involved directly in the management, preparation for emergencies. And we found very critically that if they believe that's the community standard, the norm, if you like, they are more likely to act. So they need to feel competent and they need to feel that it's valued and then do it. No amount of talk is going to help. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Carl. Anne?
Well, I want to thank very much everyone for inviting me to sit on this panel. I don't know much about Western Australia and the Aboriginal communities, but our nonprofit has been working with tribal communities in the U.S. since about 2006 through a grant that was provided to two of our research associates, myself and a colleague. We're research associates at a Center of Excellence for Homeland Security called CREATE, and our program is called Working Together for a Safer Tomorrow. And we've been working with tribal communities, doing risk assessment, risk management, economic analysis, cost benefit, with them since 2006. So we have there's only two of us in this program. My colleague is American Indian, he's Oneida. I am not. So I usually go into these communities extremely humble, and I engage with the risk management, emergency management, fire people, and just start a conversation and find out what their gaps are, what their worries are, what their risks are. We have developed some models and tools that we've used successfully with some tribal communities. The one I'm going to be talking, I don't want to talk too much about the Arctic, because I'm going to be talking about the community that I've been working with most closely since 2013 tomorrow, which is Barrow, Alaska. How many have been to Barrow, Alaska? Raise your hand. Well, in the U.S., it's called the Top of the World. That's the community's name. It's the Top of the World. And we are working with Canada right now, and that's what I wanted to stress during my discussion. The Risk Management Office in the North Slope Borough is what their geographical area is called. Alaska has boroughs instead of districts or counties. I'll tell you again, you can convert this for me, all right? 89,000 acres. What is that?
20,000 hectares.
And Michael says to me yesterday, that's nothing.
It's a small cattle station.
So it's all a matter of perspective. But in Alaska, that's a huge chunk of land for a tribal government to be in charge of. And it is a federally recognized tribal government that runs that amount of land and responsible for the North Slope Borough's public security and safety. And the staff is 3 people. They have a risk manager, a disaster coordinator, and an assistant disaster coordinator. And I have known the risk manager since 2008 when we went for a risk assessment through our Center of Excellence funding. But everything we've been doing up there since 2013 is either cost share, fundraising, donations, and small grants. I don't know if you know much about the Arctic and what's going on in the Arctic, but these people are facing hazards they've never had to face before, and they have, of course, a huge background of resilience and risk understanding. They're subsistence hunters, so they depend on a host of wildlife. They have a wonderful wildlife management program there. and have had for years to make sure that their harvesting is sustainable. But tomorrow I'm hoping my videos will show you the most recent storm surges that are occurring because of climate change in the North Slope. The city of Barrows lost about 100 feet in the last, I want to say 30 years to their coastline, and that's the city. So our focus, because it's risk management, is coastal infrastructure and helping them with that gap. They identified that as their major priority right now, and as I told Michael, I don't do anything unless they tell me to do it. So it's we're creating a relationship that's, I don't know, it's participatory research, but also it brings in practice and policy at the same time, because some of the things that we are doing together has actually been implemented in their policy and planning, such as the hazard mitigation plans. We're trying to be holistic. The model I use is called historical ecology, which I'll go over a little bit tomorrow. I don't want to go too much into that, but it's very much across historical, social, and natural and physical sciences. It's a team effort. So we're constantly inviting new people into the team as the priorities of my colleagues in the risk management office identify what it is that they want us to do. So does that help?
Thanks very much, Anne.
Mm-hmm.
So as I said, we want this to be a conversation, and I know a bunch of the folks from the Department of Fire and Emergency Services and a lot of our New Zealand colleagues who are here would have a lot of insight and background in this sort of area. So this is our conversation, so who wants to take the lead?
This question's for Erin. Erin, how do you ensure a consolidated and coordinated approach to what you're trying to do in remote Aboriginal communities? And who do you partner with in that space? I know DFES are out there trying to do that work, and local governments in some areas are trying to do that work. So are you working in partnership with agencies, and how do you ensure that coordinated, consolidated approach?
Thanks, Paul. Well, in WA, sad to say that we lost our funding to be able to do that, and we had a really great officer up there who was starting some really great things. As I said, a place-based approach is how we start. So in terms of building relationships, it's the relationships that Red Cross already have. So it's not really emergency services relationships, it's relationships with the community through our community programs. And some of those programs may be food literacy, working with single mothers in terms of supporting them. They're programs which have been going on for decades. So that's where we start. But in WA, I know that Jock, he was up there and he was forming some great relationships up with Deeps in the office based out of Broome. And when the Commonwealth Government were up there in Beagle Bay, he was working alongside them when they were doing work too. So it's definitely not in isolation, and it's not an easy thing. In terms of the rest of Australia, it's the same approach, is that there are relationships that we already have and we're adding on to them. But as I said, in terms of finding solutions to some of these problems, it's about partnerships. It's about working with the community to find out what they need, and then being a conduit or facilitator to find those people who can find the solutions for them and make sure, it's interesting, I think the topic of the day is how does local knowledge work together with scientific knowledge? But in a way it should be the other way around, because local knowledge is already there. How do we make sure that the knowledge that we have can marry that? And I guess that's a role that we like to play until somebody else comes in and somebody takes their job. We don't care, but it needs to happen, and I think it's only in partnerships before an event. Does that help? Thanks.
Next statement. All right, I'll
Yeah, look, my name's Phil Kearney. I'm from the Broome and the Kimberley and cover the Pilbara as well. And the issue of local knowledge, and particularly in relation to Aboriginal cultural communities, and that is probably something I've experienced the hard way over the last 8 to 10 years. And I probably would make more of a statement about this discussion, and that is that we've seen programs come and go, and from the eyes of the Indigenous people, and that we're just seen as seagulls. And probably if we were to do this properly, we would have to do the research to understand these communities, their culture, what's gone before, what they've experienced, what the barriers are, and how do we sustain it by building those relationships. But it's not only building the relationships with the communities, it's building the relationships of all the players that have something to do with the emergency management response. And if we can get that sustainability in those networks going, I've worked with Jock from the Red Cross with Beagle Bay, and we had baby steps there and saw huge potential, but it stopped, and it's happened so many times. That's the frustrating point. Maybe the conversations we have here will drive it a little bit more to have a go to identify what can we do, what do we have to accept that that's the way it is at the moment, and we'll have to do it to them as opposed to working with them. I don't know a lot about North America, but I have looked at Kiwi and the Maori side of it and seen different relationships and sustainable type programs. So there is hope, and there's a lot of knowledge out there. And there probably is a PhD for someone, but I'm a practitioner, so I won't be taking that on. But that's all I wanted to say in relation to it, and probably in support of Erin and what little has been tried. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing up the practitioner aspect, because I'm a researcher by training, but I'm working with the practitioners in these communities. And so it is all about team building and relationships and trust. And knowing that you're there for their benefit to help them, and it's definitely bottom up, we are trying, I just want to bring this out because I promised my colleagues I would talk about this, because we just got a U.S. Embassy grant from Ottawa to start a proposed plan for something called an Arctic Risk Management Network, which is right now bilateral between my North Slope colleagues and the Inuit and other communities in the north of Canada. And of course, all of this is very, every country has their own policy and practice with Indigenous populations. But we're going to try this to do a regional jurisdictional cooperation effort, because all of these communities are facing all of these new hazards, and they don't have anybody to help them do the research with them. And so we're hoping to create. So after this session, I fly to Canada to the Sarcine conference, Search and Rescue, where I'll be working with the EMOs of the North and the SAR Secretariat to try and create this infrastructure and logistics to see if it'll work. But it's a solution to try and get participatory research in all of the communities between Canada and the US. And it's not just my idea. This came from the North Slope risk management colleagues. So it has been a building of a partnership to do this.
Just to reinforce the point you made too about trust, while we're waiting for the next questioner to screw up his or her courage, and that is what our work shows, and what's clear in the literature too, is that trust is critical. It's trust in one another within a community. It's trust in the institutions and the service providers. And if for some reason that's eroded, and I have to say, out of control burns tend to do that in the fire space, if that's eroded, you get some pretty immediate negative response from communities, and they tend to start to say, well, I'm not going to do that. And they also model themselves on the local community managers. So if the local government's not appearing to manage its own properties and is not enforcing its own regulations, then that appears to feed into a lack of trust and competence. So there's a lack of trust in institutions and a lack of trust and competence, both of which can be critical to the sort of thing that you're talking about, whether it's an Indigenous or a
Exactly.
regional
It
community.
doesn't matter whether it's Indigenous or not. It's, how to come across as you are an assistant for community-based decision-making. That's it. You're just an assistant. They have to make the decisions. You can't for them.
A lot of the communities we work with are often small or they're remote. Some of them, I guess, there are Indigenous people throughout our communities. But it's often a challenge for some small or remote communities to have the capacity or the capability to take part in processes like this. You've all talked about local knowledge and valuing that. What projects or plans are there in place to build that capacity within those communities so that they can deliver the services that are currently being delivered by external organisations?
You want to answer that?
Well, really, there isn't that many. A couple of years ago, in former life, I worked for the West Australian Local Government Association, and I undertook a project looking at how can we build capacity of remote communities to engage in the emergency management process. So whether that's meeting local government in terms of emergency planning, and what the research showed was it shouldn't be local government down. It's not local government's responsible to engage. It needs to be community up. But there's a massive gap in building capacity there. And I don't have any easy answers. We know how it could be done, but in WA we're talking about 280 discrete remote Aboriginal communities, from size from 10 people to 800. I don't know if you can help me. Yeah. So, and most of them are within the Kimberley too. So it's really difficult. So I don't have an easy answer. We know it's an issue. Don't know who's responsible. No one's responsible. I think it's a collaboration, but there needs to be a commitment and to put some resourcing behind it. I'm not too sure, but it's a gap that's definitely been identified.
Now, are you talking about research capabilities or just?
I guess in the short term, it's about getting the jobs done. In the short term, it's about getting the jobs done that need to be done. But longer term, I guess you're thinking if you're looking, you want to be replaced by local people eventually. You want to have that capability and capacity within the communities, so it's not an external organisation, or have them as part of your organisation.
Yes. Well, our effort is to try to do a little of each, but it's all experimental. And I'll be reporting on some of the community-driven projects that we're trying up there with the Risk Management Office's support. But it is an experiment.
And I didn't want it to say all doom and gloom. There are some great projects. I know that DFIS are doing some work up in the Kimberley, and there's a lot of community engagement projects as well. And it'd be great to see what comes out of some of those pilots. But at this stage, we're waiting for that information and see whether those things can be rolled out across communities.
One of the things I think is important, again from reading the research literature rather than being on the ground, is that you can point to a community of any size and say there are networks, there are people here who influence one another, some strongly, some less so. And some of them aren't much bigger than a family, so you're really talking about a household almost, and others you've got those networks developing. But one of the critical things is not much point in having strong networks, a strong sense of capacity, if one of the things that's missing is the link to those organisations and experts who can provide some of the technical and practical assistance that's required. That it's sometimes called, bridging capital or linking capital, so that your community is good, but you don't know how to get what you need. And I think one of the things that we don't do very well, particularly with Indigenous communities, is assisting them, empowering them to negotiate the system, to know that where they can go to get help, who they can ask for resources, how to build their own communities. Who's in charge here? In a sense, it's not top down. It's the resources that most of the rest of us take for granted because we're well informed about them. You know, we assume that everybody knows, and often they don't, and that's what's missing.
Could I say a couple of things? Oh, sorry. One of the things that's troubled me from some conversations I had many years ago, mainly with Indigenous groups in far north Queensland in the Weepa-Bamaga area, was discussions around, we've been here for 40,000 years or whatever it was, and we did pretty well in surviving in very, very difficult natural conditions for an awful long time. And I wonder if we have not explored some of the stuff that's been handed down from generation to generation as to how these things have been handled by those communities in the past. I mean, I'm sure we have, but I remember one conversation with a guy that said, we don't worry about bushfire, we actually use it. You can't throw a spear through thick bush to kill the animal that you need to eat. So we use bushfire actively, and stories like that. And I wonder if perhaps there is still time to understand the mechanisms that these communities used to survive for the 40,000 years before we came along, and that's something that's always
in our
very...
project, we do include that because it's historical science, historical ecology, which means looking at people and the environment over very long periods of time. So I do have one project where we're looking at disaster legends, and we're looking at those that are published first before we start interviewing the elders, but I'm being led again by my colleagues in the Risk Management Office as far as how to do that. We also have role plays that we created out of historic disaster legends that are being used for tabletop exercises, which I don't know if I don't think I have that in my slides tomorrow, but they chose which ones they wanted us to use, and we wrote up role plays for them. There are ways to do that.
Again, if I can intervene, one of the interesting things I think here is that you've got traditional Indigenous knowledge, which is genuinely held, that really does come from people who've had and maintained a close connection with the land. And then you've got the mythology about those Indigenous practices, which are sometimes misinterpreted and misunderstood. So that I've had Indigenous people say to me about Northern Territory, for instance, some of the burning, and the Kimberley for that matter, some of the extreme levels of burning that are going on there. This would never have happened if they had actually been doing it the way we used to, but instead now they're driving past in a four-wheel drive and throwing a match into the spinifex, for example, and so much bigger area goes up than would otherwise be the case. So Indigenous people are being critical sometimes of the accepted wisdom because it isn't. So I think pulling apart what is genuinely traditional knowledge from what seems conveniently described as Indigenous knowledge or is misunderstood is important, and that's why sitting down, talking to people and talking to the senior people and the elders and those who've been around for a while rather than the interpreters, I think is important. Yeah.
I was just going to go beyond the relationship. We talk about developing relationships, but there's the step beyond that, and I think, not to blow the council's horn or anything, but we've kind of gone beyond that in some ways, in that we've brought in co-governance. We've got, in our council, we have Indigenous seats. So within our region, we have 3 seats that cover the different tribal areas, and we have MOUs with specific iwi or tribals, so that it's gone beyond just developing a relationship to actually bringing them into that co-governance level and taking direction from them. And that feeds back out, and the community see how much we value that relationship and how their information is actually feeding ours. So I think where you can go beyond that into this co-governance, you actually get a really strong, much more level playing field between that knowledge. So it's just something I think we've been developing and learning as we've gone.
Yeah, there's several communities that I work with that have gone to that next level and have mutual aid agreements or at same type of thing. That is a suggestion, of course, in our government structure for emergency management, is to have mutual aid agreements. But in our tribal entities, they're sovereign, so they can decide, what they want to do about just about anything. So, yeah, mutual aid. For example, the risk manager, they've been working on a mutual aid agreement with the Northwest Arctic Borough for years, and they finally signed it just last October. So that's wonderful that they've gone to that next level.
And there are a number of local governments in WA that do have seats at the local emergency management committee level for representatives from communities. But I think what needs to be worked on, how do we make it easier for people to engage, especially when we're dealing with huge, vast areas of land, when it may always just be local government council and the community may be kilometres and kilometres away. And I think that's what needs to be worked on as well.
Yeah. And yeah, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to focus on regions and localities too. It's hard.
I'm John Mitchell from the Joint Centre of Disaster Research at Massey University in New Zealand. Can I just ask the audience a question? Is there anyone here who would regard themselves to be a representative of an Indigenous group or another ethnic group? So I spent a lot of time working in British Columbia, which is similar to New Zealand in that it has a constitutional arrangement, a relationship with the Indigenous people, where, as just been described in the Bay of Plenty, there's a requirement to engage with and treat each one another as partners. And that works to a greater or lesser degree in different locations. One thing that really strikes me, particularly in British Columbia, is that at conferences like this, there will be at least 10% of those participating and the audience will be from Indigenous groups. And they have one organisation that's been going for quite some time now called Finesse, which I think is quite smart, but First Nations Emergency Social Services. And they look much more, they look at a broader set of issues and capabilities than just response. They look at comprehensive emergency and risk management. But there are also representatives of a whole range of other groups as well. There was one on a course I was at a few years ago. She was representing an Ethiopian community in Vancouver, and she was their emergency manager. There were 16,000 people in that community that she was representing. But the difference that's made there, and I wonder, and this is somewhat rhetorical, and you've kind of answered it with some of the earlier questions, I think, but the difference that is made there is that the agencies of the province, so equivalent of the state, go out of their way to ensure that those organisations and groups are represented. It doesn't actually cost much. Have there been efforts to do that, to bring them to these conversations, because then they become part of it? The discussion so far about going to them and doing whatever it is to them, I find interesting and a bit disconcerting actually. But have there been efforts to try and do that and bring those groups to the party, if you like?
I think you'll have to ask the organisers. That's a message to the organisers of the conference.
Well, we did fund some of our funding, went to several of our fundings, gone to the risk managers and the borough to go to conferences that are research oriented, and they have just been, it's been very good for them because they're not usually put in the practitioner research balance and have to speak. One of them was the Department of Homeland Security's Center of Excellence called ADAC, Arctic Domain Awareness, that was just funded in 2014. And I said, I was invited to go. I said, I'm not going unless you two go. We all three were there.
Question here, if I can. John Tillman, question for Professor Lawrence, based on your work, a little bit of change in discussion, I guess. You talked about people's risk perception being based on real experiences, either their own or what they'd learned from neighbours and so on. Given that a lot of the information we put out there is quite prescriptive and instructive about what people should be doing in preparing themselves or their property or their bushfire survival plan, we don't seem to be very good at capturing the life experiences for those people that may not have experienced themselves. So I'm talking about not what you see on Channel 9 News or whatever, the camera in someone's face when they've just lost their house. I'm talking about the Australian story type interview, perhaps after the event, that people can describe their experiences through natural disasters. I guess a question to you, what are your thoughts on the effectiveness of that type of information sharing for those people that may not have had the life experiences, whether you think that would be an effective way of engaging people to be more proactive, and I guess, you know, how do we do that better?
Look, I think it would be that the information that we had in our research project was that the closer the, if you like, the experience, the better the preparedness and the risk, higher the risk assessment, better preparedness. But having stories told, particularly, whether it's local people telling stories about the fire 5 years ago or the fire 10 years ago, stories that included information about what worked and what didn't work, who was saved and who wasn't saved, you know, those sorts of stories seem to be quite potent in also raising awareness of the risk and getting people better prepared. So I think the more vivid the images, I mean, this is true across psychology generally, the more vivid the images, the more people are able to identify it with my place here now, the more likely they are to see it as a risk. And especially given that we know that that place attachment, the threat to place attachment, is something that also triggers response. So in a sense, you're using fear, and you have to be careful not to overdo fear. It can backfire. But raising it just a little so that they're anxious enough that they'll start to do some of those things on the basis of the stories they've been told, the images, vivid images, and as you say, sustain, not just, you know, a few quick news bulletin items. But that sort of material would be far preferable in a way, you know, to have a local screening of a really good movie, video, you know, bringing people together and then after the event, discussion about it, that sort of thing would probably be very effective, I think. But certainly the stories that are told through networks, and you can get communities that just change on the basis of if you like, a shared story. And there's a couple of examples in the United States where one community which had had a fire basically decided that on the basis of that experience, the best thing to do was to be prepared to leave. So they did very little in the way of preparedness for their properties, but they had a really good disaster exit plan. And another community, for reasons that are not altogether clear, moved in the other direction. They didn't know what to do once the fire happened, but they did a hell of a lot of preparing to prevent it happening in the first place. So those stories can be very powerful, and I think it's where emergency management information givers could be, I think, a bit smarter about what it is they put out there. Lists and pictures. I've seen some of the local government stuff. It's uninterpretable, you know, even in terms of what you should do. So, you know, simple, direct, emotion-based, connected stories are much more likely to be effective. Yeah.
There is
I'm sure you know all that, but I mean, it doesn't happen very often.
There's one great example of a great project in Margaret River, and exactly that, sharing information, sharing stories through newsletters. I'm sure you're aware of this one, John, and it was a great collaboration, the local government, Red Cross and DFIS as well, to share those stories. But the difference is they've experienced that, they're a recovering community. Yeah. So how do we make that experience real for people who haven't experienced that? But that's a great start, and it won the State Resilient Australia Award last year, so it's definitely been recognised for that work and that approach.
I think we've got time for one more comment from the floor before we wrap up.
I'll just go quickly, just for John on that, and this is only in my opinion and observations working in the areas I've found, you know, particularly with our Aboriginal people, and that sometimes our structures, our concepts and that are very hard to communicate, and they don't understand what it is, and I'm not picking on them in particular as such, because it's also for the broader community. We talk about how do we engage, how do we communicate about dealing in emergency management, bringing them along. There's a lot of barriers up there that Erin related to about distance and you know, understanding their communication networks, that it's something that we need to look at, learn and work out how do we put the strategies in place that are effective. But coming from them more than, and that's why we're probably going out to them when we get the opportunity to do it, to try and talk to them and then see if we can build that capacity. But I think we're a little bit off that at the moment. That's why we're probably having this conversation. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I do want to make comment on the previous question about, or discussion about experience, because from my experience with my project interview study, I think experience can impact people's risk perception and behaviors, but it depends on what experience it is. Especially in fires, experience can go different ways. Because I actually heard a story that in a fire, one of my interviewees' neighbor, who were old couple in their 70s, and they left their house at a very early stage in the past fire. However, there was a fire burning just adjacent to their house, and then their neighbor, which is a young guy, he was standing defending, and he was able to put out the fire for that old couple's house, so their house survived. And then that old couple came back and with the conclusion that we can actually stand defend. If we are there, we can just use our hose to really put out the fire easily. So I think the information is really critical from the agency to direct people to the right understanding of risk there. Thank you.
I don't disagree, but that's an unusual conclusion to draw. It can happen.
I was wondering if the panel has any closing remarks or comments they'd like to make based on the discussion.
Not really.
Please come and share your experiences and projects, because I learn from other people all the time, and it would be wonderful to have a support network for people who are working in local Indigenous groups.
And a great way to start those partnerships that we've been talking about. So.
And I guess don't forget the power of just people rubbing shoulders at the local store and across the fence, and when they're picking up the kids from school. If you can insinuate yourself into those sorts of networks, that's when it really works. And that's where the local fire brigade, the volunteer fire brigade, those sort of people, the educated in the community, educated to emergency management, they are very potent, sometimes called mavens. They become a kind of focus for knowledge.
Thank you very much
for
having them.
Thank you very much, Carmen, Erin, Anne, for leading the discussion today, and thank you everyone for actually participating in the discussion and turning it into a conversation. And I think the important part is that this is not a conversation that stops now. It has to continue. And there's a lot of different knowledge and learnings and research that needs to be passed around from different environments for different ideas and for cross-pollination. I'd also like to thank the State Emergency Management Committee again for allowing us to put on this session this afternoon. If you want to know more about what we're doing in the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, and we're doing some work in some of these areas, please come and visit David and I. We've got a booth here. Go to our website, sign up for our various communication newsletters and notes around the place, or keep in touch and just give us a call. But thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Carmen, Erin, and Anne.